And welcome back to our writing project where we're going to be writing a scary adventure story. This is lesson 3. So what I'd like you to do now is in your books is to write the LO I can use subordinate clauses. So press pause while you do that. Okay, welcome back. So as you know, we are going to be using the story Killercorn as a basis on which to magpie and create our own scary adventure story. So before we get onto the subordinate clause topic today, you're going to listen again to me reading the story of Killercorn, and you're going to be thinking about what are you going to change about this story, what kind of scary creature, where's it going to be set for when we come to plan this story over the next few lessons. So put your pen down, listen, and then we'll come back and we'll work on subordinate clauses. Killercorn. Come on, Fred, called Megan, excitement sparking in her sapphire eyes. As the siblings trudged through the gloomy forest, Fred's heart sank. His younger sister had begged him to bring her to the woodland after reading a legend about a unicorn spotted there. Finally, several irritating days of whining and pleading later, he yielded. Now, as night threw its shadowy cloak upon the world, Fred questioned the wisdom of his decision. "Hurry up, Fred," she called. "I'm coming," he shouted back in a frustrated voice. Soon after, they stepped into a glade. From above, the moon bathed everything in a ghostly silver light. Small creatures rustled in the undergrowth, and nearby a solitary owl hooted eerily. Like furry spitfires, bats swooped and swerved as they hunted nocturnal insects, squeaking in delight. The unpleasant odour of decaying leaves hung on the air. "The book said the unicorn appeared right about here," announced Megan in a hushed tone. "Yeah, and Snow White was riding on its back," Fred sighed, rolling his eyes. "What did you say?" asked Megan, as she examined the grass for hoof prints. "Nothing," grumbled Fred. Suddenly, some nearby shrubs began to shake. Then, the unmistakable sound of a horse's neighing echoed amid the night. In response, Megan's features became more animated as she scanned the darkness in anticipation. "A unicorn! The legend is true," she shouted, eyes brimming with hope. Just then, a creature emerged from the greenery and stopped behind the excited girl. Fred's eyes widened in horror. His sister was correct. It was a unicorn, yet this terrifying beast was unlike anything he'd ever seen. With a coat the colour of midnight, it was a powerful stallion. Its malevolent red eyes burned like the fires of hell. However, it was the twisted horn which sent a shiver down the boy's spine. It was razor sharp and dripping with fresh blood. Noticing the colour drain from her brother's face, Megan was baffled. Slowly, she turned around and saw the unicorn. A cold knot formed in the pit of her stomach as she let out an ear-piercing scream. "Run, Megan, this way, quick," Fred bellowed. Without hesitating, Fred grabbed Megan's arm and dragged her away. Hearts pounding, they shot off into the trees. Behind them, the horrific animal let out a blood-curdling neigh and lowered its horn. Then it bolted after them. Running like the wind, the petrified pair fled through the forest. Meanwhile, the thundering of hooves grew steadily closer. With a sinking feeling, Fred realized it would catch them, and soon. Just then, they arrived at a fast-flowing river. Mustering every ounce of strength, Fred picked up his sister and launched her across the water to the other side. Although she was wet and muddy, she hauled herself up the river bank to safety. "Leave me! Go!" he screamed at the top of his lungs. Suddenly, the monster appeared. Snorting loudly, its blazing eyes fixed on Fred, he gulped hard. "Come on, then! What are you waiting for? Come and get me!" he yelled, waving his arms in the air. Lowering its dagger-like horn, the unicorn gave a mighty neigh and charged. However, just before he was skewered like kebab meat, Fred grabbed an overhanging branch and heaved himself upwards. Unable to stop in time, the brute crashed into the river, screeching in anguish. It was washed away by the powerful current. I think you should ditch unicorns, Meg. How about mermaids instead? Asked Fred, utterly exhausted. Eyes wide, Megan regarded her brother in awe. Welcome back. So we're going to be looking at subordinate clauses. Now, we've done a lot of work on this in class so far, and if you remember, a subordinate clause is a part of a sentence. It has a verb, however, because a clause must have a verb, it doesn't make sense on its own. So look at the one on screen now. As the siblings trudged through the gloomy forest, that is actually there. The yellow is the subordinate clause, and the blue is the main clause because it makes sense on its own. So, for example, Fred's heart sank. That makes sense by itself. The verb is sank. But as the siblings trudge through the gloomy forest, it's incomplete. It has a verb, trudged, but it's not a main clause because it doesn't make sense on its own. So, let's take a look at this sentence. Now, by the way, when you have a sentence which is has a subordinate clause and a main clause, it has a special name and it's called a complex sentence. So the subordinate clauses, although she was wet and muddy, so was, that is the verb, and the main clause, she hauled herself up the riverbank to safety. So she hauled herself up the riverbank to safety is a main clause. It makes sense on its own. Now, here's another complex sentence. This one has a fronted adverbial, now, then it has a subordinate clause, as night threw its shadowy cloak upon the world. And then you have the main clause, which makes sense on its own. Fred questioned the wisdom of his decision. Now, he questioned whether his decision was sensible. Let's take a look at this one now. Again, we've got a fronted adverbial, a main clause, and a subordinate clause. Now, in this example, the subordinate clause comes after the main clause. So, in response is a fronted adverbial. Megan's features became more animated. Her features are her face, and more animated, she became excited as she scanned the darkness in anticipation. So, the main clause, Megan's features became more animated. Now, lastly, here's a very complex sentence because it's got a fronted adverbial, it's got an adverbial at the end, it's got a subordinate clause, and it's got a main clause. So look at the fronted adverbial. Like furry spitfires. Those of you who are interested in history, especially World War I and II, the planes that were used were called Spitfires. They're a warplane, and they would swoop through the air with a great agility. So this is a simile. Like furry spitfires, bats swooped and swerved. So bats swooped and swerved is the main clause. As they hunted nocturnal insects is the subordinate clause, and then squeaking in delight is an adverbial. Okay, here you have got 5 subordinate clauses. While the storm raged. When I arrived home. Although some people disagree. If the unicorn caught them, because lions are very dangerous. Now, each subordinate clause has got a comma at the end. You're going to add a main clause that would make sense. Let's talk through each one. While the storm raged, so what was someone doing? He or she, what did they do while the storm they're probably inside or they could be outside. What are they doing? That has to make sense on its own. When I arrived home, so what happened when I arrived home? Think of a main clause that makes sense on its own. Although some people disagree, you need to then have a statement. So, for example, you could say, France is an amazing country. Although some people disagree, I think France is an amazing country. If the unicorn caught them, what would it do? This has to be would. It would. What would the unicorn do? What would happen? Or they would. And then because lions are very dangerous, what? What do you have to do because lions are very dangerous? So I'm going to expect to see these 5 subordinate clauses as part of a complex sentence with a main clause afterwards, either a full stop or an exclamation mark. I'm really looking forward to seeing that work. So thanks for taking part today, and I can't wait to see what